Hello, everyone. Today I have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Danny Wyatt. Now, Danny is based in Sweden and I'm in London, and we were kindly introduced by the lovely team over at Humans. And when spoke with Danny, I was really impressed and taken by his approach to people products and technology. So I thought that's someone I can learn from. And here we are today. So, very kindly has agreed to do a podcast style chat with me, talking about some of our thinking. But before we get into that, Danny, I would love to hear from you a bit about your background and how you got into the role that you do today.
Thanks for that. Yeah, happy to share. I started my career in recruiting. I was based in San Francisco, and I worked for a lot of smaller tech companies throughout that time. I generally was working with teams around like 20 or 30, and then most of the companies that I had worked for just happened to grow to several hundreds. And spent a lot of time doing that. I had moved to Sweden about 3 years ago, and with that move, I thought I wanted to kind of change my environment a little bit. I really enjoyed recruiting, but I also really enjoyed making my own job easier and finding a way to qualify and quantify the impact that I was having. And so much of that leaned towards like this recruitment operations lens that I was just very fortunate to land at a good time where Clio was looking for a recruitment operations person. After joining the company here, though, it was clear that a lot of the impact and a lot of the processes that we need to build extended just beyond the recruiting team. And so my role quickly kind of moved into more of a broader focus on, I guess you would say, enablement, which has now led to like this very, very deep dive into tooling and integrations and process building. And it's been a good, it's been a really good journey. Feels a bit weird to be the one that someone thinks they can learn from because I feel so uh, in a healthy way over my head a lot of times. But I feel like there's so much to learn and just trying to make sense of all of the different ways that you can approach a problem or come up with a solution or find a new technical way to solve that. It feels like there's a lot that I still need to wrap my arms around. That's me.
Well, I don't think that's a bad approach because I think if you constantly question why, then that's not a bad thing. And funnily enough, I've also come from a recruitment background. So started an agency, always in London actually, but started an agency, then went to a very big company internally, which is Sky, so 25,000 people. After that, moved to the complete opposite. So a bit like you did the startup thing, 25 people ad tech company where I was essentially the only one doing anything people related other than the EA who was looking after office management and also a bit of people partnering and all the classic startup stuff. And that's when I really fell in love with building and becoming a change agent. And that's kind of been a theme ever since. So whilst I continued to do internal recruitment for a few years after that, then I segued sideways into a people transformation role. And then that's led me to the role that I do now, which is head of people operations. And that's very much not your kind of shared service type facility. It's very much thinking about how we can leverage technology and products to make sure that the people experience is really amazing and also really seamless. So thinking about how we can challenge ourselves in terms of automation, integration, just making sure things run seamlessly, so that we can spend the time doing the things that we need a good human for. So
Yeah.
yeah, very much a change agent can relate to you. Constantly learning, getting things wrong all the time, but that's part of the fun, I think. So first, we are going to talk about tooling.
Mhm.
And when I think about tooling, I think about technology that you can buy essentially to help manage things for you. So that might be an ATS, an applicant tracking system. It might be a HRIS. It might be a performance management tool. So many options out there. But maybe first, Danny, if I ask you around people technology, does implementing new tooling solve all of your problems?
Yeah, it actually does. No, the no, definitely not. I think there's a lot of excitement always with getting something new and shiny to play with. And it's been really cool, I think, if I just think back and reflect on the places that I have been so far in my career. I think they've all had very different approaches to how they procure and acquire tooling. I've been at places where if you need it, you get it. If you want it, you get it rather. Um, and I think lately we've been challenged, as a lot of people have, where our strings become a little bit tighter, and we're trying to be a little bit more cost conscious with tooling. Um, just really challenging ourselves to like use what we have in the best way possible. And if it really is not fit for purpose, then we can consider what do we need? What does our ideal process look like? But you can see how quickly a lot of that kind of goes around in circles, and validating a good tool and understanding its implications on other tools you might be using, and actually understanding what that's going to do to the workflow and the amount of BAU work that your team is doing, um, is in and of itself a costly exercise. Um, but I think just taking a step back and understanding the appetite for your team to acquire that tool, what is missing, what are we not getting with what we have, and before acquiring anything, I think, I've come to enjoy and learn to challenge how we do things with what we have, because in a lot of cases we've seen that it's not necessarily the tool that is the problem.
Mhm.
I think so much of it is just around behavior and how you interact with that. And I think there have been some really cool stories. Just we could probably go into it a long way, but like how a tool has gone from a somewhat negative perception into a very positive one within our company, just because of how we're using it, or um, how we've set it up. And I think a lot of those are just notes back to ourselves and other teams on implementing and running a methodical sort of change management program, communication, all of those things. But no, I think, to answer your question in a word, I don't think a new tool is always solving your problems, but they can be fun to play with.
I completely agree, and I'm so glad you said the word behavior, because I remember that's when we first met. That's exactly a word that you used at that time, and it reminded me of. I did an interview with someone who probably doesn't even remember asking me this. Her name was Melissa, Expedia. This was years and years and years ago, and she asked me about implementing new tooling, and it was exactly teed up in that way. So. First, before you introduce new tooling, let's have a look at the behavior and like why
Yeah.
things are happening that way. So, I guess an example that I've seen in my career is that if you think about performance management, and often it'll be like, let's bring in a process or a tool to help force managers to do a
Hmm.
performance management round, and write out their feedback once, twice a year, three times a year, whatever is decided. But I think before you bring in the tool, it's really interesting to ask, why aren't managers doing that anyway? Because
Yeah.
I don't think I know I work in the people space, but like I don't think I've ever been told you must have development conversations with your team, you must have regular check-ins on their performance development goals, etc. I'm just doing that. So why is it that we have leaders in the business that aren't doing that? Is that because we've
Yeah.
promoted loads of ICs who've just never been trained on how to do that? Do they need some training? Is it because they don't know what questions to ask? Is it because they don't really understand how goals are set, or how to help people in their development, so they shy away from those conversations? So it's not to say the tool wouldn't help nudge those things with some great questions and reminders on timing, and of course tooling can be hugely helpful in that, because we all get busy and we all forget to ask those really amazing, powerful questions sometimes. But like, if it's not happening anyway, I think it's important to just first dig into why.
Yeah. Because I think when you have a tool for like every pain point, you end up in a really noisy environment. Like
Yeah.
you end up being in a lot of different platforms and doing a lot of different tasks that aren't connected. So you end up with five to-do lists across different browsers. And personally, I don't love that experience. So the more simple we can make a workflow, I think the more impactful we can be in standing up a business that runs effectively.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Um, and also with the kind of performance example, sometimes people then, um, some poor people leadership might then go to say, okay, then I just have to do it once a year. It means
Yeah,
that instead of having those conversations all the time, they're like, "Oh, okay, I don't have to have that conversation until November," and then they'll put it off. And then what happens in November is that they have to do these massive feedback rounds, etc., all at the same
100%.
time, because they're like, November's the only time we do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you were talking earlier a little bit around bringing in new tooling. How might you go about deciding if it is a good time to bring in new people tooling?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, well, Yeah, this might go a different direction than what you're intending, but I think that we have a couple of different ways to look at it. One is like, is this something that we can do with what we have? I think that's the first question. And in a lot of cases, it's my experience has been that that answer is kind of like we can sort of do it, but not the way that we want to. Um, and I think that you're then, sort of faced with the question of like, do we want to build a way to do that ourselves? Or if it's something super important and impactful to the business around like rewards, for instance, um, I think there's some maturity in just saying that there's no way that we're going to build something as well as some company that has dedicated their entire mission to having a great pay band analysis and rewards program that they run within that platform. Um, I think not to cop out, but it does come a lot down to like leadership and priorities and what are we actually trying to accomplish? Because I think in a lot of cases you can get some energy behind the motion to acquire that tool. But once that is implemented, there has to be that change in how we operate to
Hmm.
incorporate that into what we're doing every day. And I think that's the hard part, right? It's not the investment as a cost to procure the tool. That's a lot of it, but it's the investment in making sure that we're then having a changeover date to where this is now how we operate.
Yeah.
And I think that requires a commitment from the entire body of people to uh, really make that effective. Because when that's not done well, you can see lots of dips in engagement and confusion and ineffectiveness. And those are generally not what you're trying to bring about when you bring on a new tool.
Yeah, that's such a good point I haven't actually thought of in that question is the like ongoing ways of working. And I think we can all get really
Mhm.
excited about new tooling, especially in the people team. We can see the value of this, I don't know, really understanding everyone's potential and succession in the business. But actually, is it something that people are going to use? Are they going to use it over the long term? And is it going to provide us with value and data that is really key and impactful for the business? Maybe yes, but maybe no. I hadn't connected that dot, but that's really interesting. I guess where my brain was going to on that question is, yeah, to your point, being clear on the problem that it is that you're trying to solve, and can it be solved in different ways. Sometimes you just need a Google Doc or a Notion page that
Yeah,
gives
100%.
some people some interview questions to ask. Like, it doesn't have to be the full shebang overnight necessarily, and sometimes that's a good way of testing whether people actually want it, because sometimes people will be like, we need this thing, and then you release it and then no one uses it.
Exactly. And I think in the people space too, there's a lot of tools that have duplicate, you know, functionalities,
Mhm.
and I think that can be really confusing. You can
Yeah.
have different ways of reflecting your current org structure that maybe aren't in the same structure as far as data goes, or you always want to make sure that you're keeping your the source of truth.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you end up kind of upside down, and people seem to get upset about that. So
I
avoiding that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you've kind of teed up the next question nicely. But just to finalize on that last question, the other things I'd be thinking about are um, return on investment. So,
Mhm.
one, being clear on the problem, and if the tool seems like it's going to solve that problem, being clear on the return on investment. And what I mean by that is that instinctively, sometimes tooling can seem quite expensive, and often it is. And often, if you're speaking to SaaS companies, try and negotiate, because there's often a deal to be had with those companies. But actually, even though they seem expensive, if as an example, we use DocuSign at the moment for signing docs, and
Yeah.
annoyingly, on that platform, you can't just bulk download the documents that are on the back end. And there was a question in the past where we could buy this tool that would download it for us, and it was really expensive. I won't say the
Yeah.
cost, but when you compare that cost to the time of our legal team to manually download 500 documents, if you their hours cost versus how much it would cost, that would probably mean the tool was worth buying anyway. But if you can think even more so about the trade-off of, if they're not working on that and instead they're doing a massive commercial negotiations for the business that are going to like give us commercial success over the long term, clearly that's way more impactful commercially than it
Yeah.
was to spend a few grand on this tool, even if it instinctively seems expensive. And I think if you can weigh up that as a trade-off, and also the kind of risks and user experience opportunities there are with the product as well.
Mhm.
I think sometimes these are hard to quantify when you're doing a business case, but if you can think about these different elements, I think it can help you, depending on the stage of
Yeah,
company, weigh it up.
and I think to that note too, one of the earlier points that you had brought up, I do want to circle back on because
Yeah.
I think that if you can prove out, you gave an example of a Notion page or a Google Sheet to solve a quick or maybe somewhat recurring pain
Hmm.
point that could be addressed by a tool. I would be a huge proponent of always exploring that, just because then you can really validate um, the the cost down the line, or especially like you can gain a better understanding actually of the process itself and understand like what your needs are as a customer. And that can help kind of guide those conversations for if you do decide to procure a tool. And then you had a second point on the yeah the size of the problem you're trying to solve. I'm trying to not be so theoretical here, but it's really easy to face a problem in the face and say we need a tool to fix this. But in a lot of cases, um, the most like impactful ones that I've seen working with here, even at Pleo and previously, are those problems that get bigger and sort of worse the longer time goes on. For something like a one-off reporting or dashboards, I think there's lots of ways that we can spin up something that works because in a lot of cases we've seen those be used in like quarterly reviews. And something like that is quite painful when the time comes around, but when we um, think about some other ambiguous problem that we will always have as a business. And if we acquire this, then the bandwidth of people, your legal team, for instance, is freed up significantly by procuring that. I think that's a pretty easy case to make, so long as it doesn't create some sort of technical debt down the line in how we're connecting it to other systems or how we're getting information to or from that
Yeah.
platform.
I could not agree more, Danny. You just got me thinking in my head about a few years back. I think in the people space and generally we're acting in much more agile and productized ways these days. But certainly, if I look back a few years, something that I've seen happen in my organization, but lots of others, is we decide we're going to launch a learning management system, for example, but we keep it as this hidden project in the people team for a year, and we build all this content, and it's amazing, and it's like all singing or dancing, and then we launch it a year later, and then it does or doesn't land. And I think if you, to your point, if you can just iteratively release stuff, and maybe it starts with a Google Doc and maybe it builds, and little by little you can kind of test and learn along the way. I think that's for me really the best approach to
Yeah.
learning and seeing if that's something's going to land or not, rather than so much time, money, and energy can be wasted on things that people don't use.
Yes, and I actually want to bring up a quick point that you made me think of there. I've had a mentor and a manager at Pleo that has really changed and challenged the way that I think, especially around how we roll out things or work on things. And it might be very simple, but actually working in public and like letting a public Slack channel know what is going on and what you're in progress with. I know there's like a lot of confidentiality in people projects in a lot of cases, and like the knee-jerk reaction is to think this is private, it can't be viewed by broader people. But I think you can gain tons of credibility, and I would actually challenge that so much of what you're doing, even if it is like an offboarding process. There's a lot of fundamentals to that are not confidential, and you can gain so much input from people viewing that. And I think you can gain a lot of credibility into like your work and understand your users a lot more if you just put some of that out in the open. And that sort of collaborative approach, I think, has really like given us a lift. It's not been ongoing in the people space for a long time within Pleo, but I think even on some of the projects we're working on right now, we've seen a huge impact in just understanding what we're trying to build
Yeah.
before we're too far down that line.
Yeah, I love that. They sound like a great mentor. Um, you just reminded me of something that I once did a behavioral science course, and one of the things they talk to you about is the IKEA effect, and it's the idea
Mhm.
that if you're involved in building something, you're way more likely to not only use it but defend it and promote it to
Mhm.
others as well. So I
Oh,
think
that's funny.
the
Yeah,
idea of like co-creation and collaboration means that people are way more invested early on. I think that's like a nice magical extra effect as well.
100%. Yeah. And I think, not in every case, but I think in a lot of cases too, like having credibility within the people team is sometimes a struggle, I think, to broader
Mm.
organizations. And giving some transparency into what you're doing and how you're prioritizing and what the impact of that would be, I think only stands to benefit the team in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I love that. And whilst we're talking about people tooling, you mentioned earlier that there are so many people tooling options, HRS, performance tools. Some of them will do the same thing, some will be a crossover. Then there's benefit systems, like there's just so many. And I know that you're passionate about integrations. Can you tell me a little bit more about your thinking there?
Yeah, of course. So, we've seen a big shift, especially here at Pleo, where, a lot of the tools that we had rely obviously on the data about a person, who their manager is, where they sit, where they live, what contract they're on. Um, and, when we, even thinking back to like a year ago, most of that information is housed in the HR system. And the systems that rely on that weren't connected. So it would be like a weekly CSV download and upload to make sure that data is right in both places. And there was always a lag time, and there were always messages about my reports are incorrect. Can you look at that? There's a survey going out in Pecan, and we need these to be correct. Um, and I'm not embarrassed because I think it's been like such a great like learning curve to really understand the importance of integrations. And I think it's shaped a lot of how we procure tools, just to understand if they're like as nice as the features are, if they're not compatible, it's going to add work to people's plates in addressing tickets about information being incorrect. And like data inaccuracies have also been like a huge um, sort of like rock to throw at our little people glass house right now, just
Yeah.
because if information is wrong, it's on us. And it became confusing where information actually lives and how to update it and how to make sure that happens. And so we took a step back earlier this year and just made sure that if we have a tool that can be integrated, we spend the time going heads down and ensuring that we have an ecosystem and not just a bunch of disparate tools. And I would say, especially at our scale of like 1,000 people, that's like extremely important. But starting that work early at the time of implementation and understanding while you're looking at vendors for something like background checking or surveys or engagement or feedback reviews and things like that, making sure that it can take information from your system and it can securely access and pass it back if it needs to.
Yeah.
Um, has been not only like really good for the employee experience, but it's also taken a ton of work off of the people team because we don't have a lot of people to address tickets and, you know, data entry essentially to make sure that mistakes are corrected. Um, that investment has been super impactful. And I think that's why I like the job I have, is because you're taking a task that did not exist and you're eliminating it from someone and you're giving back time to work on things that actually are impactful to, I would hope, anyone that wants to be working day to day, they're not just plucking away into an Excel sheet and making sure that things look right.
Yeah, yeah, more commercially impactful work. I love what you said there. So the kind of the two themes that stood out to me is one is when you're thinking about tooling and purchasing tooling, making sure that you think about that ecosystem. Do things integrate, or can they integrate in the near future?
Yeah.
And because that really can save you so much time, money, energy, and just reduce the manual risk of error in data going back and forth in spreadsheets, or someone manually uploading something to a PMI system, for example.
Hmm.
So many wins from that. But on the flip side, the other thing you said was around that can only be as good as the data. So we've
Yeah.
had exactly the problem that you described in the past, is that often you'd get to engagement survey round and they'd be like, oh, this person needs to move to this team, this person's actually not in
Yeah.
this team
The
anymore, and that's
scramble.
because we're relying on the HRIS data and no one's updated it. So I think the data
Exactly.
piece as well, you were talking about, for example, linking your ATS with your referencing tool. Again, very much a fan of that. But if the if in the TA system you've marked the wrong department that they're being hired
Yeah.
into, then they don't end up with the finance checks that you need to legally do, and then you've gone wrong. So yeah, it's only as good as the
Exactly.
data that you can have in there.
Yeah, and it's always challenging too, right? Because the point at which you know that it's incorrect is often like too late in a lot of
Yeah.
cases, or just a bad experience at that point to try and correct it and then resend it out. Um, so I think we've I think spent a lot of time in building processes for how data gets to that point. Um, and try to run a huge sort of education round now of like the importance of things when they go into a certain place. And if something is wrong, here's how to correct it. If this is wrong, it's on you. Like building a process that people have some control over to make sure that the accountability to maintain that data is obviously on us, but to uh, input it when changes occur in the business that we should know about. Um, we've given a lot of power to people to be able to manage that on their own.
Hmm.
And that's sort of just the MO of the company I work for. But I think it's taught me a lot about where the inputs are and ensuring that it's clear when there are mistakes to people and making it easy to correct those mistakes if they are there.
Yeah, completely agree. And thinking, just to build on what you said there, like thinking about how within, let's say, the HRIS tooling, like how can you nudge people to think about these things? So, for
Mhm,
example, if someone's moving from my team to yours, Danny, like how can the tooling through either workflow nudges or hopefully
mhm,
AI in the future say, is their team and job profile and whatever else changing at the same time, and
mhm.
kind of nudging that behavior so that data can be more accurate? Because yeah,
Yeah,
could not agree more.
yeah.
Um, and in this tooling section, the final question is around success. So,
Mhm.
what do you think about in terms of measuring success in a people tooling um,
Yeah,
launches, or how do you know success?
I think it's been, well, in a lot of cases, we have known what success looks like because we know where the pain is, right? And
Mhm,
we started this whole thing on data is incorrect. And so just going back to that last point of like, make it really obvious when it's wrong to people. Where do they live? Where do they see their information? Where are they seeing that it's incorrect?
mhm,
Making it very obvious if it is correct and incorrect and giving them a quick way to correct it if it is. I think that's been that solution. But there's a lot of other there's a ton of metrics you can look at. Um, I think it comes down to the process itself for onboarding, for instance. Like we've had a big pain point in completion time for right to work checks, and like it came up that the tool we're using, the provider, was just not fit for purpose for us. I think it was taking too long. It was very manual. People had to create an account that was needed to be like logged into in another browser. And then we took a look at it and we said there's a ton of tools that can incorporate directly with Greenhouse. Um, it's then on the candidate. The turnaround times are way faster. We don't actually have to manage any of this from our end, and that was worth the cost on our end once we just finally had a chance to sit down and say, is this serving us, and what is it costing us, and what is the additional work that
yeah,
we're having to do as a result of this costing us? Um, but I think the tooling itself, when I think about it in the context of where I'm working, it's like, is it an accurate reflection of our organization? Is data secure? Do people have what they need to do their jobs well? And I think we've done a pretty good job of just gathering feedback to help kind of prioritize our project list. And then, of course, the kind of catch-all for all of this is just ticket volume. I think that's been the thing that's guided us a lot. And what do we need to squash? Because when a ticket comes in, someone is then having to dedicate time to work on that. And in most cases, I would say, perform some action that could be helped along by a better integration, a workflow that doesn't exist, or some sort of process that is falling short in some way. And I think we've really leaned on ticketing, and I think that's been kind of a fun thing to look at. And obviously, all of that is improving now with supplementary AI and things like that. So, um, how do you measure any success? I think it comes down to what do you view as important, and
yeah,
um, what are your realistic expectations for improving that? And I think as with anyone on a people team, we want happy people to be high performing. And if we can move any of those up and to the right, we are doing a good job.
yeah. I can't wait to watch that section back because I know I'm going to be making notes on what you just said. I thought that was hugely valuable.
Okay,
But
good.
because I think I guess we've both come from that talent acquisition background, and I think in
Yeah.
TA a lot of what we do versus in kind of people ops, people tooling is more obviously measurable. Like you can see a hiring funnel of how many people applied and how that goes
Yeah,
down the funnel into how many people were hired. You can see interviewer success. You can see if you do change a career site, you can see how many people clicked on that and click through, etc. And there's
100%.
so many like very obvious metrics. And I think when I reflect on people operations, of course, there are things that you can look at, but sometimes, yeah, it's not as obvious and as easy as that. And I think you highlighted some fabulous things in there, so I can't wait to read them back. But um, also, I think it's so fascinating to think about. For example, engagement data. So you might meet with your tooling provider and they might say, everyone's logging in every month. And you might think,
Yeah,
that's amazing. But for some systems, that might actually not be amazing because
yeah,
if
yeah,
I think about benefit system, for example, like yes, it could be good that they're logging in every month, or it could be they keep having problems and you keep getting their data wrong, so they keep logging in to live support every month. Like so that actually
yeah,
might be a bad
yeah,
thing. Sometimes it's good if people can just get what they want to do done, and then they don't raise a ticket and they don't have any issues and everything just works seamlessly. So I think it's really important to balance that kind of quantitative and qualitative feedback that you can get. And of course, there's surveys. You can think about that return on investment, time saved, risk mitigated, all of that kind of stuff that you're alluding to there. But sometimes it's not as like metrics clear
yeah.
as other
No.
teams can be.
And I would actually like this is one thing that I made the mistake of a lot early in my career, which is like survey
Mm,
exhaustion. Like you don't need to ask everyone how it was all the time. I think
mhm.
that if you bake in metrics that imply how things are working, um, you can learn a lot more. And I think if I replace all of the time I spent at the that part of my career with filling out a form where we think we want to have 4 out of 5 stars for this, and we don't know what that means, but like let's try to weight these questions appropriately. You spend all of that time actually like meeting and understanding the problem a little better. I think it would have made for better process, and I think people get really you should have an outlet. People should have a way to say if something is not working or give feedback. But I think that's back to the point of working in public and letting people have a forum there. Um, but I slap myself a little bit for how many like how was this experience? How
Yeah.
was the survey? That was 5 questions. Answer 5 questions about the survey. Like I think we did a lot of that to try and qualify the work we were doing to show that we're bringing an impact and a lift. But in a lot of cases, people are already annoyed that they're coming into the process. Like get them out of it as soon as possible.
Yeah. Survey fatigue is real for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Cool. I'm going to move us on to the next section, which is around
cool.
change management. And what spurred the idea for this section for me was I was at the CIPD conference in London about a month ago or so, and I went to a talk by Toby Hoff, who's people director at Hi Bob, and he was talking about this idea that change management is not a program; it's very much constant, and it should be. So I thought I'd ask you about that. Do you agree that change is
Oh
constant?
yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. I think that we've had um, a lot of cycles within um, any company I've been in where priorities change and work starts all of a sudden and needs to be done now, or work that you poured yourself into kind of stops because it's no longer prioritized. Um, I think just thinking about everything as iterative, and it's really um, just important to bring people along with you as you're building things because having a turnkey sort of operation where all of a sudden things are different this day and everyone must like adapt or die, I don't think is a very like well informed approach. But I think outlining what you're trying to change, and I think if you've done a good job of meeting with the people that you're trying to serve in this, um, you should hopefully be changing in the correct direction, and people should be a little bit along the journey with you. And if you can explain how the work that you're doing is going to improve some element, whether it's adding a little bit more work to their process in order to have better output at the end. I think there's ways to illustrate that hopefully any change that you're making is aligned with the values of what you're all trying to achieve together. Um, but I think the program itself is going to change drastically from the scale of what you're trying to implement. But in general, just being communicative in your team and with that, and then outside of your team as much as possible, um, is kind of a guiding principle, I would say, not to make it profound, but I think just trying to communicate as much as possible along the way, can help bring people into the fold with you.
Yeah, what I heard you say there is good communication throughout and just making sure the why is really clear. I think that's sometimes what's missing is when I don't know, an exec launch like decide to change a programming language. If the why is not clear, that's when people get
Yeah.
disgruntled. And I also, frankly, sometimes you will, as a business grows and changes, sometimes that means that people that are there, even if they're great, they won't be right for the company anymore, and that's okay too, because they
Hmm.
might align themselves with really like startup culture where they're part of something that's 20 people, and they, when the company gets to 200, they might not feel aligned with the kind of ways of working and how things are done anymore, and I think that's okay. I don't think that's a bad thing
Yeah.
necessarily. I The other thing I think about this is you may or may not agree, Danny, but I'm personally so disincentivized when people talk to me about like 3 year, 5 year, whatever planning, because every experience that I've had is any time that I've tried to plan, I think it's important to have a vision, but whenever I've tried to think about planning beyond, I mean, frankly, 6 months, but like let's say a year,
Yeah.
I've never seen that come true, whether that be the business or people team. I think things happen so fast. In the people team, something will knock you, whether it's IR35 changes or that you'll have sudden attrition. And I think for me, coming into that change management approach is just being really adaptable, being willing to pivot and not planning so far ahead that you don't have that ease to pivot. It's like being willing to change with whatever's happening in the people team and the customers that you're representing, but also more broadly, like what's happening with your like customers of the product and
Yeah.
what's happening in the market.
Yeah, I think that that's funny because when you think about long-term planning and you use the example of 3 to 5 years, I was in the like 2 quarters ahead mentality of
Yeah.
like, yeah, long-term plans are hard. But no, I have the same experience, I think, as you do. And just personally, I'm like a pretty optimistic person. I like to get excited about plans that we commit to. And I think it has a pretty like destructive effect on me when those plans pivot because I can get myself really amped up for like what we're going to be looking like in a
Mm.
year. And when we decide that something else is more important, that we didn't have like a kickoff event around and like a bunch of like rah rah, it can feel like another cycle and it can feel a bit endless. Um, so yeah, I agree.
So I'm going to move us on to the next question, which is thinking about projects or product launches. What can you do to try and make sure that what you're working on is going to be successful?
Yeah, I think it's, oh man, this is actually uh, a really good point because I think that I'd received a bit of feedback, um, you know, in the past couple of years around some stuff that I was really, really excited about working on. And I thought I was doing a pretty bang up job on it. And it's not that I wasn't, it's just that if you took a step back and realized the time investment for this product versus if that time were spent elsewhere, the impact was really small. And I think that can be the really hard thing too, is when you're at an organization where there's not a lot of people tasked with building out process and making sure that things flow really well and giving people tools to do what they need to succeed. I think you can end up with these a little bit upside down, and maybe this goes back to earlier points on like long-term vision and things, but um you can end up working a bit more on less visible but more highly impactful projects and have
Mhm.
to deprioritize your favorite group of people that want something that's going to take quite a bit of time that's just not going to provide the business with that much lift. And I think that's something I'm still not great at, to be clear. Like I think I will give a little bit of my time to make sure that other people aren't suffering for no reason, right? Um, but I think that it takes a lot of effort to look at the impact of what you're going to be working on, and I think it takes a lot of buy-in to make sure that things are successful. In a lot of cases, it's not just that, HR tooling and your what you log in and look at every day is not going to be the thing that makes it successful. I think it's making sure that people are on board with what you're doing and really sitting down and understanding why feedback is the way it is, whether it's positive, keep doing that, or whether it's mixed. And some people are a little resistant to coming on board with what you're trying to incorporate. Um, I think just like not to be TED talky, but like understanding that people are going to make this successful. It's not the process in a lot of cases is not going to run without the influence of someone powering it or initiating it in some way. So I think that things you can do to make sure that happens. Um, think about incentives. Think about why someone would want this to be the way that it is. And if you're asking someone to do something uh, that's just a bit more work than they want to do, or a couple more steps that they're not used to, really illustrating that uh, the impact at the end of it and explaining that you totally understand what you're asking them to do. I think that you can't do anything totally in a basement by yourself and then spit something out at the end of it and expect people to come on board. I think you have to understand, you know, who your end user is, what their job is, what they're experiencing, and why they might be resistant to that in order to make what you're putting out at the end of it successful.
Yeah. Yeah. And you referenced at the start of that question around how you might have been working on something and then being asked to work on something else. And I think that ties nicely into our last question around change management, in that, yes, you can communicate the change is constant and you can communicate the change and you can communicate why that needs to happen. But I think maybe an extra layer that's I've just learned from what you've said there as well is how important it is to give people a second as well in
Yeah,
between that
100%.
change, like just to get over that change curve. Just because you've known for a couple of weeks that you're going to pivot as a business doesn't mean that the team's effective. Don't need a second to be like, whew, breathe. Okay, now I get it. I'm ready to pivot. But sometimes
Yeah.
you need that second to pivot.
And do some dry runs and make your rollouts as incremental as you can stand so that people understand
Yes.
like what that change is going to look like and what it means for them and like how they feel when they click the buttons. Like I think that a lot of that can be really jarring if like you put yourself in the seat of someone whose job in some way changes. Like usually not malice if things aren't followed. It's like people are confused or not brought along or forget. And I think that having a lot of empathy for, you know, the individuals that you're kind of impacting is a
Yeah.
prerequisite in a lot of cases for a good
Yeah,
process.
I agree. And when we think about the other things I think about when we're talking about successful projects or product launches, and this is very much learned from lots of failures along the way, is with any project, it's like first having a clear why, and it sounds simple, but it's so important
Yeah.
to have a clear why, and making sure whoever's accountable for that project that you all very agree on that why is. Like I've had times in the past where I've had a lovely slide where it's had like three key whys or like three
Hmm.
key objectives, and actually we haven't had the chat about is one actually the most important and the others are lower
Yeah.
down, like, and there's been a misalignment there. So making sure that that why is really clear, making sure it's clear what impact you're trying to achieve and how you're going to measure that. Getting together your power team. So another thing I've seen lots of in the people space happen before is you feel the need to include everyone, all the people partners and all the people in TA. And actually, if you can have a power team of like that, like one person from each team that needs to be there to really feel empowered to build the thing together and be responsible of having that two-way feed to their teams and really good communication both with them, but also the kind of broader stakeholders and then the business. So thinking about those communication layers is really important. To your point earlier, like transparency, the more you can be transparent, I think the
Yeah.
better. Um, and then I think just to loop back on some other things I've heard you say throughout is then iteratively build in as far as possible. Can you test along the way, launch things? Can you have a pilot group? Can you test and learn? And then the other thing I'm really passionate about as well is once something is launched, you're not done. I mean, you'll probably never be
Yeah.
done, but like making sure that you learn both from your power team, like doing retro, whatever you want to call it, of how could we have worked better, how like lessons learned along the way
Mhm.
before while it's fresh in your mind, and really make sure that you don't just make those notes. So nothing other than long-term planning, nothing else would turn me off more than doing a retro where someone writes the thing on the whiteboard and then no one ever remembers these actions
Yeah.
that you agreed. I'm very passionate about like, if we're going to do this, let's make sure we
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
embed that change. So yeah, really having those conversations and thinking about how you can change and learn for the future, but not only with your power team, but also then obviously the business as well. So thinking about how that could go even better for next year.
Yeah. So actually, let me circle back and be less theoretical on a couple of points. On the transparency and communication side, some of what we found to be really what I've learned to be quite effective in some of the rollouts we've done recently, where they're quite large scale. Like we're taking how we interact all the way back from when a candidate is hired through how they're onboarded at the company.
Hmm.
Not from a candidate experience perspective, purely from where does data get put in by the talent team? How does it get passed to the people and like culture advisors? And then how does that then affect the employees onboarding? Um, Writing up like really plain language documentation on what you're doing and why. I think that the 3 points thing that you mentioned, one of the approaches that I was helped along a lot by like the IT team who does these really nice write ups of like, hey, this is the change that's going to happen. Here's what it means for you. Doing something very similar, but then giving people a chance to like expand that and understand technically deeply why this is happening, how it's going to work, is an exercise that I have been trying to bake in a lot more to my workflow of just like really explaining it clearly for everyone to see what's happening and then kind of where you are today, like why this problem exists and why we think this solution is going to fix it. um, but then also I learned in like writing up this technical documentation of like here's how every single piece will connect. um, in that first pass I learned there was so much that I script did not know. Like I you kind of breeze over how things are going to be built or how things are going to work, and making sure that you fully understand when you click this button, this is what's going to happen and this is where it's passed to, is I think just a really good exercise in understanding what you're signing up for in the program you're trying to build, but also like get ahead of the expectations that you're promising. And because I think people in a lot of cases just want to know the impact on them and how it's going to be affected. And if you're not like as bulletproof as you can be while still remaining iterative on what you expect to be the change, I think you can lose a lot of people on the way if what is being pitched to them is changing all the time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
I I absolutely love what you said there around what problem are we trying to solve and why we think this process or tool is going to solve that. And I
Mhm.
especially love the word think there, because a bit like when a company they build a software and they hope it's going to work, like we're taking bets, like we're
Yeah.
just using the data that we have and the best intel we have in the market to do our best, but frankly it might not work. The process of the tooling might fail, and that's okay
Yeah.
sometimes, but and hopefully it doesn't, but like uh,
Yeah.
we think to that point, like everyone takes considered measured bets, and we do the same in the people team.
100%.
Yeah. And you started talking in that last section around prioritization, which I think takes us nicely to the next question. Because when I think about prioritization in the people team, again, it's so tough. And the reason I say that is that we have, you might think about company strategy and what in the people team we need to do to solve that. That's one kind of lens. So you might need to spin up a new product, and therefore we need 50 engineers to do that, and where we're going to hire them, and so we need to hire them, we need to onboard them, we need to, I don't know, maybe we need to set up operations in Australia because we're going to hire them there, so we can kind of have some things that need to be done as part of our strategy that link to company strategy. That's a great way of looking kind of top down. But
Hmm.
in the people team, I wish it was that simple, because then you'll have other things. So you'll also have legal or financial things that happen. So you'll have a massive IR35 legal change, or maybe your employment law in Australia says that everyone needs to be given food vouchers now. So there are things that just happen legally or financially that you just have to get done, for example. And then you have the other layer of what's happening kind of um, bottom up. So kind of what's happening on the ground, what data are you seeing? Are you having a massive issue with attrition in one area that might be a priority? So kind of how you manage all of these things. Have you had that experience, and how do you think about prioritization in general with people teams?
I think it's actually quite hard to prioritize the people team. And I think,
Mhm.
especially at Pleo, um, the like our people domain, there's a lot of different roles within that. And I think in a fairly common case, some of the priorities might actually like compete a little bit within the team itself. And I think that we've had um, a much better exercise of actually prioritizing a bit on the team level to make sure that we identify those needs and how they roll up to the broader company levels. But just having a moment to share what the teams are prioritizing, and then especially take a hard look at how realistic those goals are in relation to like the amount of BAU work that we're doing on a daily basis. And fortunately, this example is a little bit rosy on our end just because we've had a moment to say like we have some ambitious goals for the next couple of years that we all have to nail in our individual roles in order to make it. But let's kind of prepare the runway and take a look at the foundation of what's going to enable us to get there versus spending all of our time doing these tasks manually.
Yeah.
And I think we've had a bit more of a reflective tone lately of just like what in the example of like HR tooling and stuff, we hit this point where we built so many things to service people through like Airtable forms and things like that, that, just the cost of like the task of managing all of those to make sure things are working and that like automations are mapping correctly. Once you hit like, 30 different things that you're working across within your team, like it's not scalable. And
Mhm.
so um, I think fortunately we've had a pretty good um, alignment to say like we're going to kind of stop some new stuff right now and stop managing things that we know we're going to replace, and let's instead build in a different way so that things are more directly integrated and we're not relying on tools that are slowing us down in the long run.
Yeah.
So fortunately, I think we've had a pretty good prioritization within our team. I think managing those expectations to the broader business has been the challenge because um, some of the problems that they're facing in their job, we could continue to fix in the way that we have, but we're going to have a harder time getting into a more scalable, mature environment if we spend a lot of time just hammering on quick fixes the whole time.
Yeah, completely agree. Sometimes we build all this configuration and workflows that need to be maintained and make a rod for our own backs there. Um, Another thing that happens quite a lot in people teams, and I've been guilty of in the past, is being driven by what senior leaders ask for. And often they have great ideas, but sometimes their ideas aren't the best. And so an example of this is when I first joined my current company 5.5 years ago. I very fortunate that I came in as a tech recruiter, and then they needed to hire rapidly, and I was told by a CTO who I had a great relationship with, we're going to hire 8 recruiters underneath you, and it was a case of yep. There was no conversation with me at the time of why 8. Do we need them over the long haul, like, or actually do we just need a spike of support from RPOs or agencies, because actually we're not going to need all 8 in a year, and like have those conversations. And I didn't have those. And I think with all kind of people processes, like you'll get a manager come to you and say the performance process isn't working, we need to do it once a year, it takes too long, we're not doing it twice a year anymore. How would you recommend, when senior leaders or exec come to you with those kind of conversations or challenges, how would you recommend people deal with those?
Yeah, guilty as charged, just
Yeah.
like sounds good, let's do it in the past. But I think really just biting the bullet and being a little bit annoying on asking why to understand the problem from their generally expensive perspective is worth the pain, because I think this is all going back to the change management side too, because like those come at a cost to the business. And especially if you sort of double back on a mistake, like if that was not the appropriate approach and we're instead going back to the way that it was before, I think that, personally, I always feel a bit of a why didn't I speak up if I had a feeling that this was kind of an unfounded proposal, or maybe it was. And like if there is like a well documented, reason why we think the performance process does take too long, uh, I would love to learn it and dig into it. But I think that I I wouldn't necessarily be doing my job to its to my best ability if I blindly answer to a prompt and do my best to hammer out a solution because I was told to. I think
Mhm.
understanding, um, you know, why something might be the way that it is, what problem are we solving by changing this, and you know, what yeah, if we do a performance process once a year, like there's downstream impacts of that. Is that tied to pay bands? Is that tied to what people earn, how satisfied they are? Um, Instead of it taking too long and reducing the frequency, why don't we just try to make it take less time? Is there a way that we can support in a way that makes this process a little bit easier or make it more incremental along the way versus a one-time scramble in November to get an end of year review done? Um, I think coming with proposals is hopefully what a seasoned leader would want versus um, hopping to the first thing that comes to mind and
Mhm.
spending a lot of time going back and forth until you find the right solution.
Yeah, I would, when I listen to this recording back, Danny, I'll have to, like, count how many times we both use the word "why," and it's cliche, but it's true, like, just
Yeah, it's
asking why
true. Yeah.
is so pivotal, and I think, just to build on what you say, normally, an exec approaches you with these kind of questions or feedback, it's because it's not because they're trying to be awkward. It's because one of their leaders might have raised them this, and it's
Mhm,
just understanding and being empathetic to their situation. Where's it coming from? How can we help you help your teams?
mhm.
Resisting the urge to jump on that request and just being curious and learning more, because it might be that it's not just them, it's the whole business that are thinking this way, but it might not be. So kind of delving into it, understanding the trade-offs, and then understanding if it is a thing, how you might prioritize that versus what else you've got in the roadmap, I think is a good conversation to
100%. And I think it's just nice to know, like, if you're working on something, if we know, not to re-parrot why the whole time, but if we know the reason that we're doing something versus just a hunch, like I think that the more that we can take a step to understand what we're trying to solve and measure that, we can look at, did this actually improve next year? And if another senior leader comes in and is then the head of the performance process, you kind of want to have a reason why things are at the cadence they are versus I was told to, right?
Mhm. Yeah. We'll have a shot every time we say why.
Yeah, okay, good. We've
Maybe,
had
I no, I love it. I think it's such an important word to use. And
yeah.
one final question, if I may, before we wrap up, Danny, is
Mhm.
around when we're thinking about solving problems. What are some of the things that we can learn from product managers in that kind of design thinking, first principles type approach? Where does your brain go to when we think
Yeah.
of that?
I think that's really fun because when we kind of stood up this team at Pleo, we called it people products, and we tried to do our best to adopt a product mindset. And I think that that's given a lot of voice to our customers, which are in a lot of cases just the coworkers that we're working within. But there's so many really, really great exercises that we've run through at this company, and like so many great courses. If you think about the general lens of product management and understanding who you're solving for and the personas that they might be associated with, it can really help you map out like a much more mature process. Um, and it doesn't all have to be like, functionality. It can be understanding like what the thing like too much. It can come down to understanding what you're all trying to accomplish together and how in a lot of cases you're not building a process that is done by one person. You're building a process that's sort of interacted with by lots of different types of people that all are incentivized and want certain things at the end of it. Keeping that in mind while you're going through your exercises of scoping things out and planning and prioritizing features or certain integrations, um, can give you insight into like what's going to be the most impactful sort of at the end of this whole process, but also what's going to give the biggest lift to the people that are most pained by things right now. Um, I think that can build a lot of credibility and sort of help along this change management process. If you get the people that are most resistant to the change viewing that the product is actually going to help them,
Mhm.
I think you can get a lot of, you know, gas behind what you're trying to work on.
So many good nuggets in there. Um, what Google build doesn't mean that it's gonna work well for us. Just because it
Yeah,
worked well in your last company doesn't mean it's gonna be right for us, our company personas, our culture, et cetera, exactly as you said. I think what you said around seeing our you call them co-workers, I'll call them employees, as our
Yeah,
customers,
yeah.
but like not only current ones, but also prospective ones as well, thinking about those personas in terms of the different products you're building, co-creating something that's right for your org and also stage appropriate. I think for me, Danny, you said earlier, Danny, that you don't have all the answers, and certainly I don't either. But I think when you're working in product builds and projects, it's actually a really good thing often, because I like to think of myself as a jack of all trades. I wouldn't say I have deep knowledge right now in anything in the people space, which is not to put myself down. It's that I actually think that's a superpower in being able to challenge why we're doing something. I don't automatically default to the 9 box grid because I've done it 10 times before in my last few companies. Like I think you can think about problems and asking the right questions so much more if you don't have to default to what's been done before.
Exactly. And I think the other thing too, not to carry it on too far, is when you think about what you expect a good process to look like, in the case of people always have the right departments. You can have a bunch of approvals on each request, and you can think of it in a couple of different lenses. One is what goes in is validated. It can't change unless it follows a strict principle of 4 or 50 eyes approach.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can build for, like, in the case of Leo, we know that we want flexibility. And I think that can be really, really hard to pin down a process where you say, like, things are true, because at any point you can change your manager, right? Like, I think that giving people the freedom to power their own data has been quite scary when it comes to, like, is this accurate? I think you have to kind of tie yourself to something, though. In our case, it was like, we want this to be easy. We want this to be quick to change. We want people to feel empowered. We know that the only constant is change, and Clio will change all the time. So we want to build a process that accounts for that. But I think you can quickly fall into, when building process, you can quickly fall into this thinking of, like, how do we safeguard this from ever going wrong?
Mm.
And in most cases, it's going to go sideways. And I think the more flexible your process is, the better. And I think that's been a huge piece for why we've tried to change sort of our infrastructure to be more scalable. Because when you're building things across a bunch of different platforms, um, having not to go too, like, technical on this, but like having a more modular approach where things can plug in and plug out, and you can change how data gets input relatively easily, and understand that you're not trying to build something that's going to reflect a static organization. People will move all the time. We're in like 13 different countries. There's always going to be movement. Just doing your best to understand that the users expect ease and flexibility has made it to where, sure, our processes are a little bit easier to input the wrong information, but at least it's easy to correct, and it's, creating less pain in the process. I think that's kind of the analysis that we had of, like, is this going to be worth it? What are we actually trying to address? People want to quickly change something that's wrong, we fix it. But we understand that that relies a lot on the end user to be steady with their pointer to click the right team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a bit like you said, your team's really tried to learn from the way that product are doing things. I think there's a lot of other teams outside of people teams that can learn from the kind of work that we do. I hope you agree with that. So, like, where my brain goes to that is things like operational efficiency, project management, really good
Mhm.
comms. I think people teams are becoming a lot more commercial these days, and
Yeah,
I think that people in our space, I think there's lots of opportunities for them to make. Moves if they want to outside the people team space, whether that be into product roles or whether that be into things like chief of staff, where you're helping CEOs or exec thinking about strategy and alignment, or kind of
100%.
operations. So I think Jessica Swan, who I'll tag, is a really great example of how she's managed to move into a COO role
Mhm.
recently. So I think there's loads that other teams can learn from what we do too.
Yeah, 100%. It's all operations.
Yeah. Danny, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Are there any things that you'd like to add, or resources that you've loved, or kind of where can people find you if they want to continue chatting?
I think that, on the note of people can learn from the people team, I think there's so much that people teams can learn from other teams as well. And I think the more that you partner with other parts of your organization that are also building process, the
Mhm.
IT team is usually a really good place to at least for me, to learn because there's tons of workflows, there's tons of like time sensitive urgent tasks, and I think that they work in a similar way as well, in a lot of cases where most of the work that we've experienced in people teams in my career has been very reactive, and doing as much as you can to stop reacting to tasks and start being a little bit more proactive in setting up a process that eliminates those from popping up has been something that I think has given a huge lift to our team. And also, like, I think on the topic of like integrations and stuff, if you there's a lot that you can learn on your own on how systems will natively integrate with one another. But I'd poke around and see if there's people within like your IT team or engineering team that are excited about, working to enable people and coach and develop because I think there's so much potential to build really great process within people teams because in a lot of cases it relies on wonderful people doing a lot of manual tasks. And I think the more you can better understand how those tasks can become easier or not exist at all, it's going to give you time to grow in a lot of really great ways.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's such a good point. And then just
Yeah.
to wrap up, if you're seeing this, you'll be seeing my name on LinkedIn, but I'll also be tagging Danny, so you can find him if you want to chat to him about any of this. And then some of the other great resources I'll link in the comments as well. But Jessica Zwan has a great book on people ops as a product. I'd really recommend. I quite like the No Rules book by around Netflix culture. It's not perfect, but even just thinking about not having to have a policy just because one person did something weird at Christmas party, like that kind of approach. Adam from Open.org releases some really cool open source work, and there's some great Slack communities out there as well, such as the talent community. So I'll link all of those. But thank you so much, Danny.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.